Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to a conversation with you about something that I think is terribly important for Puerto Rico. And I'm really glad that we have such a large number of different business associations and business representatives with us today. And thank you for helping us to put this together. I think that you're all aware that we asked Boston Consulting Group to work with us on a report, and I wanted to put it in context for you, just because there's been a lot of different discussions. The board saw that what was happening during COVID in terms of supply chain security was an incredible opportunity with potential for Puerto Rico. And we knew that that dialogue was ongoing in Congress, in the executive branch, and we knew that there were all kinds of discussions hovering around what to do and how to do it. At a very early time during this debate, the Oversight Board, in the name of our chairman, Jose Carrion, wrote to President Trump and the congressional leadership just to ensure and encourage a productive dialogue between the government of Puerto Rico and federal policymakers that would look for solutions that would help the attraction of these manufacturers, if they were to come back to the United States, to come back in large part or in significant part in a rightful way to Puerto Rico. The discussions were very dynamic, and they continue to be. There are new executive orders that happen, from day to day, things that were not expected and certainly not part of our planning process, and are very welcome in many ways. There is the federal government's willingness under the Defense Production Act to use the International Development Finance Corporation to provide funding to locate pharma in particular places, not unlike the Kodak transaction, although that transaction seems to have hit a bit of a snag. The Oversight Board was looking at one specific area, carving out of all of the different dialogues and all the different things that were happening. And we wanted to make a meaningful contribution to something that we know is ongoing. We know the government of Puerto Rico is very engaged. We know Invest Puerto Rico is very engaged. We know DDEC is very engaged, and we know all of you are very engaged. But we wanted to do something that we hope will be useful to you, and we asked Boston Consulting Group to put together a study and establish the facts behind, in an apolitical fashion, defining what kinds of pharma companies, what kinds of medtech companies would come back and under what circumstances, and what was important to them when they were really important to them from a Puerto Rico perspective. And then how could Puerto Rico react to those needs, to those competitive demands? And then finally, given that, what would that mean for any potential legislation? And let me be very clear, again, we were focusing on what potential legislation would be arising from the dialogue. We didn't focus on executive orders. We didn't focus on the Defense Production Act. We didn't focus on many other things that will be helpful, I'm certain. We focused solely on what would this mean for different types of legislation. And we wanted to have a solid analytical basis, and we chose BCG as a neutral, apolitical expert that would do a data-driven assessment and provide a foundation for our thinking, hopefully for yours, hopefully for the government, but at a bare minimum would stand as a document to promote the dialogue, the questions, and hopefully some of the solutions. We understand that we are not the economic development agency of the government of Puerto Rico, but we are deeply committed to Puerto Rico's economic development, to its recovery. We get criticized often for not doing enough on economic development, and then when we dip our toe in, we get smacked over the hands because we're not the economic development agency. So I want to be clear, we did this to be helpful and to inform ourselves as well as hopefully others. But we wish to be actively supporting any effort that strengthens Puerto Rico's foundation for economic development. And before I turn it over to BCG, who actually did the report, let me just give you a few points. There are many different reports that have many different approaches. I've seen Invest Puerto Rico's, I've seen others. They all have a valid place. They have different perspectives. They come from different places, often with slightly different goals. Short wins, long-term wins, disruptive wins, traditional wins. And so I don't want to come out and ask you to believe that this is the singular report. They all have a place and they are all informative from my perspective. This report, again, looks at supporting specific types of legislation. We were looking at where the board could be useful in Washington. And we looked at what was readily doable, what was actually happening that we could support. The report does a deep dive into companies that would be attracted to expand production in Puerto Rico. These are big industries, and there's a lot to look at. We wanted to break it down into pieces that were readily understandable, readily able to be focused upon. And we thought that we should look at what could start now, not what we could do in 5 or 10 years, but what would be possible now. So we looked at where skilled workforce and available turnkey sites fit best, typically with generic drug producers who focus on returns of invested capital rather than profit margins. We focused on unique opportunities to attract companies that are medically necessary in the United States, more likely to move if incentivized or because they're managing their own corporate risks. We looked at those that have substantial supply chain risk in a single place with products that are necessary in the United States, or those that could easily adjust their supply chains where it wasn't going to require, an upending of a corporation. We also believe that Puerto Rico has the opportunity to attract disruptors, as I mentioned before, companies with new products, some of which still may be in a clinical trial phase and haven't yet established supply chains and manufacturing sites. But we didn't want to end with what was opportunity impossible. We also wanted to focus a little bit on how to overcome what are perceived or possibly real competitive disadvantages. Reputation for instability, infrastructure, ease of doing business, things that the board has been talking about from day one, and we continue to believe are important for you, existing investors, and potential investors. So on that note, if I may, I'd like to turn it over to the Boston Consulting Group team to present the report in more detail. Daniel?
Thank you, Natalie. We'll just start off here with Dex. Thank you all for the opportunity. Daniel Costa, I'm a partner with the Boston Consulting Group. We'll just start here. Okay. So Natalie gave a good introduction. We're going to spend about 30 minutes here or so on the presentation and then get to some Q&A. If we go to past the disclaimer slide, you go to the next slide and the next one. So I'll give some quick context and introduction and then turn over to my colleagues to dive deeper into some areas. So look, as Natalie just described, this study was done in a dynamic context, right? Even before the COVID pandemic, there were already lots of trends pushing on pharmaceutical supply chains and medtech supply chains, pushing the government to rethink them as companies themselves are rethinking and adapting their supply chains, whether those are global trade laws and trade tensions or other uncertainties and shocks we've seen in systems. So we did this in the context of ongoing legislation, lots of ongoing discussion. Executive orders, continue to emerge. We know, as you all know, that this is a topic that has a lot of interest and has a lot of dynamism with things approaching and changing every day or every week. And so we may have to make a couple of key assumptions in our analysis, which I'll talk about here in just a second. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate a few things that Natalie said, this is a 4-week rapid assessment. We were focused on the 4 questions that Natalie just outlined, starting from the bottom. Which companies and products are most likely to be impacted by in-shoring pressure, right? Whether that's incentives or any sort of procurement bans or other levers. And so, as you'll hear Aaron talk about in a second, we took sort of a product-centric view, a product-centric story, given that it's ultimately about which products are going to be impacted, and that then leads you to which companies are going to be impacted. So, writ large, which companies across the globe are going to be impacted by products, which products and thereby which companies, and what does that mean for effectively a potential wave of inshoring back to the U.S. So looking at that and that flow back to the U.S., we then focused on Puerto Rico's value proposition and its competitive positioning. We did not spend overly amount of time on the global competitiveness versus focusing on its U.S. competitiveness. Again, with the assumption that you're going to have a wave of inshoring as folks are looking to locate in U.S. territory. How are you competing against other areas that may be considered, for example, in economically distressed zone legislation or other powerhouses of pharmaceutical and medtech manufacturing? So what is Puerto Rico's current positioning and how might it be able to contend for any inshoring spurred by any of these measures that people are considering. We then focused on potential federal legislation, as Natalie said, and the current legislation that has been most discussed. And in that analysis, we focused pretty quickly on two pieces of legislation around economic distress zones and around guilty tax elimination, as those both had the highest potential impact and seem to be have the highest potential probability of coming to realization. And so we looked at what those alternative legislations would mean for the potential attractiveness of Puerto Rico and potential impact to Puerto Rico in terms of jobs and economic impact, and how those two would compare to each other in terms of economic impact. And then lastly, on this action plan, this conversation is part of that action plan to build towards what are the set of the 3 or 4 prongs or areas of work to actually carry these forward to action together with other stakeholders pursuing the goals of Puerto Rico, and continue to incorporate your feedback and building towards that realization. Next slide, please. And then the key assumption we made here was taking that there will be a middle of the road type incentive scheme. Now, it's yet to be seen whether there'll be any legislation or any incentive scheme, but to the degree that is going to happen, based on some of our conversations with stakeholders, our understanding is the highest probability of likely legislation will be middle of the road incentive scheme, not any of these more forced localization or what we term here extreme measures. So taking that assumption of incentives, potential benefits for attracting part of the supply chain versus the full supply chain, and sort of medium requirements rather than a full suite of requirements or bans. And then, of course, that these legislative, the proposed legislation would include and be applicable for Puerto Rico. And we'll talk a bit more about, John will talk a bit more about the specifics when we dig into the tax conversation.
Good. And
okay,
maybe before we move on from this page, this is Aaron, also a partner with BCG. This is a really important framing element, and I think we could probably talk about this and where we'd fall on this page for the next 45 minutes if we wanted to. But practically, the idea, as we had our discussions with industry and with different associations, the idea was they are largely expecting to fall into the world of middle of the road, having some carrots, some sticks, versus being required to move entire supply chains to the US. Now, I think when you look at it, the most recent executive order, it leaves the door open that for some products, for some supply chains, they may be forced to entirely move to the US, whether that happens at scale or whether the agencies that are making the decisions on which products and how much, whether they decide to go that direction versus the cost trade-off is an open one. But I think during our discussion today, we'll talk a lot about what if there are carrots and sticks. If companies are mandated to move full supply chains, you end up with clearly a bigger impact for the US and a bigger impact for Puerto Rico. Interestingly, you'd probably talk to a number of the same companies. You'd open the aperture a bit, but I'll try to hit a little bit of that as I talk through which companies, which products, and the value proposition to Puerto Rico. So if you move to the next page, and one more. Look, the lens that we took on this was, once again, which products are most likely to need to move or to be desirable to move, and therefore which companies does that imply? Then with that, where is Puerto Rico well positioned? So the current landscape in Puerto Rico, what's the value proposition? And what can Puerto Rico then do to get in the conversation with these companies, who, by the way, most of which are not at the point where they're making decisions to change supply chains yet. They're waiting and seeing what happens. But by almost exclusively, they are open to conversations and playing out scenarios of what might happen in the future. And then lastly, as Danny said up front, which federal actions of the small spectrum that are being considered now and the most likely, which would be prioritized and why? And I think just importantly, in the context of which products are most likely to move that lead to the companies, you do have your medically necessary list. Even in this most recent Made in America executive order, still unclear which products and which pieces of supply chains for those products would be in scope. So we did our best to use the list that exists from World Health Organization, the FDA's previous lists on what would be most medically necessary, or where there are treatments that are singular treatments for an important condition, and also on the medtech side, the COVID necessary products. But we also did take into account what's the likely impetus to change and how easy it's going to be to adjust supply chains. And clearly, as most of you who are on here know, who follow the industry, changing later steps of supply chains, changing final production or final assembly, easier than changing upstream steps. So that's something we'll talk about as we go through this. If you move to the next page, look, we got a broad set of perspectives through this discussion. And this is just some logos of the companies who we had interaction with and got their views on the value proposition, as well as which products were likely to move and how they were thinking about things. There were more beyond this, as well as some industry associations. But did just want to say it's been a reasonably broad perspective. Now, quite frankly, a lot of these are the larger companies and versus some of the smaller ones. We've talked to some of the smaller ones as representative and talked to some industry associations, but there is the question of who's going to be most likely to move. We'll talk about the big company versus small company dynamic in just a moment, but broad point, lots of perspectives put into here. And we'll talk about some outliers, but actually fairly aligned perspectives across the board in terms of who we were speaking to and what they had to say. So if you move forward. Okay, so framing, what gets people excited about this opportunity? Well, get excited because when you think about within biopharma, the essential medicines, either without full US supply chains or with supply chain risks, and within medtech, the essential equipment and consumables that don't have full US supply chains or with supply chain risk. This is as much art as it is science to get to these numbers and the specifics, but you can see a number of high potential categories and types of medications and types of medtech with pretty large sales associated with them projecting out to 2026. Lots of products, and in the case of medtech, better spoken about as product groups. And interestingly, and we'll talk about it in just a moment, a number of companies in Puerto Rico, operating in Puerto Rico, that operate in these spaces. That doesn't mean these specific products are running through Puerto Rico, but it does mean the owners of them, the original equipment manufacturers, or the brand companies, they are operating in Puerto Rico in one way, shape, or form. And through that, you're going to create some opportunity. So what I'd say is, even though these are big numbers, a number of these products already do have a supply chain that runs through the US, even if it's not entirely based in the US. And this gets back to our scenarios. If you're in a scenario 2, middle of the road, where there are some carrots and some sticks, it might be fine that final production or tableting or final packaging happens in the US and the upstream steps do not. If we're in mandated full supply chains in the US, a lot of the products and product categories on this list will need to make more significant move. When we spoke to industry stakeholders, that wasn't what they were expecting to happen on any sort of a broad scale. They knew that there would be specific contracts. They knew that there might be some specific products that were impacted that way, but again, not on a broad scale what was expected. If you move on to the next page, you can start seeing a little bit of that. What we heard from companies broadly, and again, this is a synthesis, and of course there are outliers, but fairly consistent. The idea that what they want to do is create redundancy in supply chains, or thought that they may need to create redundancy to reduce the risk of disruption, versus fully exiting vulnerable current manufacturing locations. I think China is a good example here, where quite a bit of the API for the pharma industry is made in China and India. Well, for China, the idea, it's extremely costly to pick up a site and move it across the globe. It is less costly, at least as of now, to produce in China, but also China is a large growing market. So the idea of fully exiting China, when China is actually quite restrictive and has mandates out that they want more and more of their pharmaceutical and medical technology to be produced locally, is likely going to be a non-starter. So again, second sources in creating redundancy versus wholesale moves of plants across the globe being what was expected. The second point on the left is, and again, not a surprise for anybody who's close to the industry, significant bias towards utilizing or expanding existing capacity and existing footprints versus opening new facilities to support any manufacturing shifts. And especially true, it was true in both biopharma and medtech and true across the modalities or different types of manufacturing, but even more so in medtech. The idea that there's more that could be put into existing facilities, there's more that can be leveraged, there's lines that could be installed, and always more that could be squeezed out. You'd really want to do that first and explore all opportunities there with your existing US footprint, Puerto Rico and otherwise, before building new facilities. So simplistically on the right, what does that mean? And we'll come to the specific companies and examples, but what does that mean in terms of who you'd prioritize for Puerto Rico in this context of what would be most likely to be insured? Well, first, the branded companies, so Pfizer, GSK, Roche on the biopharma side, and OEMs, Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices, Medtronic, Stryker, to give some examples of original equipment manufacturers in medtech that make these essential products for the US market and have an existing footprint in Puerto Rico that could be leveraged and don't have their full supply chains already running through the US or may have some risk to their supply chains. Again, this question about upstream, or especially in medtech, oftentimes you have supply chains that run through many different steps. There may be the opportunity to consolidate supply chain steps. There may be the idea that if you need to move another piece of the supply chain or move some volume that's manufactured overseas, a bit of the lowest hanging fruit would be produce more in Puerto Rico of the volume that's going to be going to the US and create option value for if you do need to have other supply chain steps that are running through the US, you can do those in Puerto Rico as well through expansion. The second point that was on the right that was brought up quite a number of times, and I actually think that we've gotten a question about it already, is the question around CDMOs. So if you're not familiar with the acronym, Contract Development and Manufacturing Organization, you also may have heard CMO, Contract Manufacturing Organization. The only difference is the D means that you can work with those companies to do work before a treatment is approved. So it's development before the commercial manufacturing. They've been brought up many times, and we spoke to a number of the CDMOs in both biopharma and medtech. And the interesting thing about them is they're in a position where they can pool volume across a number of different players. So one site for a CDMO, let's use Catalent as an example on the biopharma side, one site could represent 6 or 7 or more different biopharma companies. And it could represent the redundancy that they're looking for in just the products that they wanted. There you see the point around being able to pool demand. The other interesting thing about them is they focus quite a bit on return on invested capital versus the P&L focus, profit focus of your branded companies. And therefore, the value proposition of Puerto Rico, both for the CDMOs that already operate on Puerto Rico, so Thermo Fisher as an example, Patheon, and some of those that do not, being able to get a brownfield site that can be quickly retrofit, stood up, refurbished, and get online much faster than a greenfield, than a build from scratch, could be extremely attractive for them. And a number of the branded companies, the pharma companies, the med techs, as well as the CDMOs, are already having some of these discussions. And so as we thought about what may be a near-in opportunity in a way of inshoring, this being involved in those discussions as a part of potential matchmaking is something that could be highly attractive for Puerto Rico, again, because it has a series of traits and assets that can be very attractive to these CDMOs and therefore to the companies that need these CDMOs to create additional manufacturing for them. If you move to the next page. So great. CDMOs operating in which space? Brand companies and med techs operating in which space? Interestingly, and I think perhaps not surprisingly, what you heard was, well, go to your areas of strength, your areas of historical strength in small molecule, and some noted the strength in biologics through companies like Amgen or BMS. The idea that probably it wasn't going to make as much sense for vaccines because you'd want to be closer to the R&D centers and new modalities, similar logic there. And within medtech, quite frankly, the only place within medtech, there are some varied opinions, the only place that we've heard really unlikely to be a fit for Puerto Rico was the large equipment, because of the complexity of shipping things back and forth and some of the technical specifications. But broadly, because of some of the expertise, Puerto Rico could be a fit for a number of other pieces. There are places where there are already manufacturing facilities that companies have. So for example, on some of the consumables outside of Puerto Rico that would need to be overcome. But I think, quite frankly, if the conditions were right, and especially working with the right CDMOs or CMOs, Puerto Rico could be quite a strong fit for a number of the different medtech categories. If you move forward. The other thing that we did, and especially important as we thought about the potential legislation, was look at Puerto Rico's value proposition versus some of the other alternatives. And as Danny mentioned up front, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at other global locations, because the assumption that we took was something significant enough had happened at the federal level that it was bringing manufacturing back in a meaningful way to the US. So the question we were trying to answer was, if it's coming back to the US, where in the US is it going to go and why? So evaluated versus established manufacturing locations and the economically distressed zones, Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, border states. The thing I'd note here is, it was difficult to answer this question one size fits all, because as you start going into different subcategories of medtech, there might be a specific location that has 1 or 2 facilities, and therefore it was seen as a strength, whereas it wasn't seen as a strength for the broader set of healthcare manufacturing. But if you move to the next page, the major takeaways were that versus the established manufacturing locations, and we talk about those, the Boston area within Massachusetts, Bay Area or Los Angeles within California, Central New Jersey, Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, Indiana, and a few others. In general, while it was noted that Puerto Rico did have some cost advantage and had some hub, especially for small molecule and some pieces of medtech, it was seen as having a weaker manufacturing ecosystem and perception of infrastructure and reliability issues, and generally, and I would say generally, not preferred versus those locations, except for some people noting that in small molecule, you might be able to squint and say that Puerto Rico would work if you could make the cost situation or the cost equation work out the right way. Versus the economically distressed zones, the specialized labor force, the track record of reliability, and the infrastructure, which versus the central New Jersey area was potentially seen as not quite as strong, versus these other areas seen as much stronger, led to Puerto Rico being preferred with a pretty strong value proposition versus these options. And again, I would note that there are, of course, caveats to this, but Puerto Rico wouldn't be expected to lose at scale if volumes were coming back to the US, and it was beyond just everyone expand your existing facilities. Because if that were the case, if it was just enough that it was going into existing facilities and no one was needing to build anything new or work with CDMOs, everyone would go with where they have a facility because everyone's cost conscious. So I would, at the most macro level, simplistically, not advantaged versus the established states, but advantaged versus the economically distressed zones. And practically, if the cost comparison could work out in Puerto Rico's favor, very, very strong value proposition, highly competitive versus those options. So if you move to the next page, where does this leave us in terms of which companies? A lot of words on the page. Very simplistically, what you'd see is these multinational companies up on the upper left, which is intended to be your large pharma companies, and the large OEMs, which is your medtech companies. And what you'd see within both of those is lots of opportunities start with the places that already have footprints within Puerto Rico, as they will be most open to these discussions about potential expansion versus needing to build a brand new facility. And you can also open the door for upstream manufacturing steps. Again, on the left and right, you would see something around CDMOs and them being well positioned to pool volume across different companies and being very attracted by some of the inherent advantages of Puerto Rico and the inherent assets of Puerto Rico. And then you'd see small to mid-sized companies, which as we thought about it and looked through, there are a few that you would probably say to prioritize early. as we thought about where you would, with limited resources, where you'd prioritize, unless you had specific knowledge of any of these companies, mostly, we thought it would make sense to prioritize the companies that have global portfolios, that have global footprints, that did have these significant supply chains and a lot of volumes moving around the globe that they would need to start optimizing for. So that led you more towards these multinational and large OEMs. Interestingly, for the mid to longer term of Puerto Rico, those small to mid-sized companies may be the most important and may have a better, Puerto Rico may have a better value proposition, especially if those companies could consider domiciling in Puerto Rico. And those may be some of the more transformative companies that could open up Puerto Rico to some of those new modalities or to advanced forms of manufacturing in the future. I think when we come to our roadmap and our recommended set of actions, what you'd see is those companies are included, but with the lens we took, they weren't the first ones that would come up. And I would hesitate to say our list is the definitive answer. I think Natalie framed it very well up front. But as we thought about it, prioritizing some of those multinational large OEMs on island, as well as the CDMOs, made the first sense from a perspective of outreach. So if you go to the next page, I'd like to then turn it over to John to talk through, given that and given what we saw happening and who was most likely to be impacted, what that meant from a legislative perspective.
Thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. As Danny mentioned in the beginning, we looked at initially a lot of different potential impacts on the federal side that could supplement, require, strongly suggest inshoring. Those financial incentives include procurement bans, they include trade restrictions, they include expedited approvals. There are, as Danny mentioned, about 15 pieces of federal legislation, and there's more happening and floating around almost on a weekly basis to incent manufacturing and improve supply chains, medical manufacturing and drug supply chains. In our work, and we'll move to the next slide, what we determined was we really wanted to focus on two types of federal incentives. One is the economically distressed zones, bottom left of this slide, and the second is the guilty elimination. In order to do that, we applied three filters, top left on this slide. What incentives impact Puerto Rico the most, which are most relevant to biopharma and medtech, and then what incentives are currently under consideration in Congress or in other parts of the administration. So as Aaron mentioned, we also took a look at these incentives and the companies, and particularly the products involved, or in the case of medtech, product categories. And we looked at what are the company types, what are the segments, to the extent we knew it, what is the tax status of those entities? Are they operating in Puerto Rico, for example, as a US branch, therefore subject to US taxation? Are they operating as a CFC controlled foreign corporation and therefore outside the US tax jurisdiction in general? So to the extent we knew that information, we put that into the model, into the mix. We, as Aaron has outlined, we looked at what is the fit of those products with Puerto Rico's value proposition, what incentives would be most likely to match up with the value proposition, and are those moves to inshore to Puerto Rico, obviously, as most of you are on the phone are aware, can take a variety of things. We think it's less likely that companies are going to come brand new necessarily to Puerto Rico, although that could happen, but it would be more extending another production line or going into Puerto Rico in terms of a brownfield engagement, a factory, as Aaron mentioned just a minute ago, that could be retrofitted relatively quickly. And then also the CDMOs, the contract and development manufacturing organizations that can quickly come in and set up shop, or again, expand an existing line, or even expand lines for multiple pharma companies. And then you'll see on the next slide, as we move to that, you'll begin to see the estimates of based on putting all these filters. And to give you an idea, that we started with about 540 companies and about 2,600 products. We narrowed that down through the series of the filters on the previous slide to about 10 to 15 companies that would be high potential targets, about 130 products in those 10 to 15 companies. Looking at high potential, medium potential, what are their potential, what are their US sales, what is the non-US manufacturing value, how much of that could be driven inshoring to Puerto Rico, and the net of it there you see on the bottom right of that slide is we estimate that between $500 million and $4.5 billion of incremental sales by 2026. So that's an estimate looking out to 2026. That's important to understand. Number two, that number represents sales of products manufactured in Puerto Rico and sold into the United States. So we'll see a little bit of detail between EDZ and guilty elimination on the next slide, but at a high level, taking, as Aaron said, these very large volumes of sales from pharma and medtech, putting it through these filters, we would estimate between $500 million and $4.5 billion in incremental sales by 2026. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of the punchline slide for the federal legislation considerations. On the left-hand side, you have economically distressed zones. If you're not familiar, I'll just cover that briefly. The EDZ legislation, there are multiple pieces of legislation. We focused on one or two that seem most likely to be passed, again, with the big caveat, if anything passes. I live in Washington, D.C., so we're all Twitter now about whether the negotiations have stopped or started in terms of a bill of any kind. But if something does pass, we looked at the EDZ proposals. And in general, if you're not familiar, what that calls for is somewhere between 30 and 40% tax credits for wages for production in an economically distressed zone. Most of Puerto Rico does qualify as an economically distressed zones. Obviously, other states do as well. So it's a pretty valuable incentive for certain types of companies, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, it also allows for depreciation credits. So obviously to incent the building of factories, retrofitting and upgrading factories. So two types of incentives there. One, wages for the individuals you would hire. Secondly, depreciation for the equipment, buildings, et cetera, that you would put into place. Different bills have different incentives, different bills have different percentages, but in general, it's a pretty healthy tax credit for spending the money to hire employees and to build out factories. Also important to note in this analysis, and one of our key assumptions is that ultimately the US parent would be able to claim those credits. I won't go into a huge amount of detail. It's not necessarily on the tax peculiarities of these various bills, but suffice it to say, in order to get the incentive for the US-based parent, they would have to be able to claim these credits in some manner. And some of the bills have language to do that. Some of the bills do not. Some of it's unclear, perhaps needs additional language to get to the right place. So bottom line, that's a key assumption in our modeling. As Aaron said, and I'll kind of close with this and then give you the headline numbers up on top. As Aaron mentioned, the types of companies are going to vary depending on which of these two incentives. So whether it's economic development zones or the guilty elimination. For economic development zones, those companies that will be most incented to move production would be ones that are cost conscious, so they're low margin. As Aaron mentioned and Natalie did as well, they have a high impetus on return on investment versus profit margin. So they're going to be more incented to want to get costs down, reduce the cost of doing business in Puerto Rico or any economic development zone. So again, that's going to push you to the types of companies that Aaron talked about, which is generic drugs, CDMOs, low-cost medtech manufacturing, consumables, et cetera. So those are the types and the profiles of companies that would be incented to be attracted, I should say, to the EDZ proposition. On the other hand, the higher margin companies, which, by the way, have a lot of intangibles, therefore they would have a higher GILTI tax base, they would want to have the GILTI elimination. And everyone we chatted with, to my knowledge, that was the case. The challenge there, as Aaron has mentioned, is where they want to locate is not going to match up with an economically distressed zone. They're going to want to locate next to an R&D center, particularly for new modalities. So again, Aaron mentioned them, California, New Jersey, Indiana, the high-tech biopharma hubs that they want to be close to, both from a workforce perspective as well as a hub of economic R&D activity. And so even though they would say, and they did, they would prefer the GILTI elimination, the reality is they would not move necessarily as a result of that. And finally, I think it's important to note that in some of our discussions in Washington, it also seems highly unlikely that GILTI elimination would end up in passing ultimately. It could happen. I never say never in DC, but as a practical matter, they don't want to move from where they are comfortable with their centers of excellence. And number two, the likelihood of GILTI elimination passing through Congress on a bipartisan basis is highly unlikely in our judgment. So where does that leave us? In terms of our estimates in the model, the potential for onshoring manufacturing value on the left-hand side, EDZ top, 1.5 to 4.5 billion. That's again a 2026 estimate of where we are. 1,000 to 3,000 employees, FTEs created in Puerto Rico, again, versus where we are today. That's a 2026 figure. And then finally, the dollars in terms of taxes. Important to understand that the taxes come from two sources only. We only estimated the Puerto Rican corporate income tax and the current Puerto Rico excise tax, 770 million, to 220 million. You see on the right the same numbers based on the same modeling, based on the same look at the filter of the product lines, much less in terms of manufacturing value, 500 million to 2.5 billion, 500 to 1,400 employees created by 2026, and then the estimated tax value for Puerto Rico, again, a snapshot at 2026, is $35 to $105 million. So I believe, Danny, I'll turn it to you to talk about the action plan.
John, just
let me let Ben chime in on one of these questions here.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks,
sure.
Danny. Thanks, John. Yeah, a question came in around transportation costs to and from Puerto Rico. How are we taking into account? I mean, certainly, between Puerto Rico and alternatives in the mainland U.S., yes, we took that into account. And of course, that is part of the trade-off and considerations. I think between the EDZ and GILTI, we did talk and think about that, and that doesn't change our relative preference for the EDZ side in terms of maximizing the near-term value to the island. Danny, do you want to continue?
Great, thanks, Ben. And happy to come back to these questions, and there are a few others. I'm just going to spend 1 minute closing here, and then come back, and we'll let the team answer the questions that are out there and take any additional ones. So you'll just skip 2 slides here. So just in closing, the action plan and what this all means for Puerto Rico, and what our thoughts at the end of the 4 weeks. These companies are talking to geographies already. We should be talking to them. If we are talking to some of these companies, great. If we're not talking to some, we should be engaging with those companies. As Aaron mentioned before, the near-term focus would be on multinationals and OEMs, particularly those located on the island, as well as contract manufacturers or CDMOs as well, whether on or off the island, given the dynamic we expect to happen. So it's making sure that we're focusing on those, again, given the timing and limited attention span, the prioritized efforts would be there. There would be a secondary wave of company outreach as well to companies that don't currently have a footprint on the island, but that have been identified as potentially having a lot of impetus to move towards the U.S. and an ensuring push and having a fit with the value proposition of Puerto Rico. As Natalie mentioned before, we know that Invest PR and others are reaching out to companies. Some of these will overlap. Some of these disruptors will overlap because they will be developing relevant products that will be impacted. Some of them may not, and there may be other reasons to be pursuing some of these companies. So this should be seen as part of a portfolio. This is not recommending that there are things that Puerto Rico should stop doing necessarily if those are adding value to the island as well. So other than the outreach, there are two elements. Naturally, continue to monitor ongoing federal discussions. We have E&Y and others have been talking through a lot of the legislation and all of the provisions there and the language and all the things that are going to be important as all of these conversations are happening now and over the weeks to come. So being part of that engagement and helping ensure that Puerto Rico gets maximum benefit will be important. And then lastly here is continuing to build the value proposition of Puerto Rico. We know there's been a lot of effort, and I know Puerto Rico for some time has been making an effort to continue to promote itself and give itself an accurate view. Nevertheless, when we talk to representatives within the industry, there's still misperceptions or different perceptions of Puerto Rico. Some people will talk about the great value of Puerto Rico workers. Others will talk about Puerto Rico workers not being up to par with other workers. So there's just differing views, differing stories out there. And so to the degree we can continue to push forward a narrative that really points out the strengths of Puerto Rico, continues to give a really good fact-based and helps debunk any myths that may be out there. And that's going to be incredibly important, including helping frame things like natural challenges to Puerto Rico, like disasters and the impact of those. But yet we know Puerto Rico has seen some great resiliency stories in the past. And lastly, here in the little gray at the bottom, moving forward, while it wasn't the focus of this effort, obviously there were a lot of through the conversations, there were a lot of thoughts raised around, building for the future, continuing to address the infrastructure challenges that Puerto Rico is working to address, continuing to ensure you're protecting and retaining the talent and preventing against that drain. And then, of course, there's additional ongoing legislation and tax issues that are on people's minds, whether it's the excise tax and getting clarity around that and that burden, et cetera. So you'll see that captured in the report as well. But didn't want to get, there's more detail here and in the materials you all have access to on FOMB website. But let me pause there and we can get to questions. But Natalie, anything else you wanted to add before we turn over?
I just want to thank the whole team, Danny, John, Aaron, all of you, Ben, for doing such a detailed report in such a short period of time. And we wanted it to be timely. We wanted it to be part of an ongoing conversation, and it certainly ended up being that. So thank you. I think, for the board, it's captured a lot of the risks, a lot of the potential, and a lot of the next steps that we need to take. Clearly, Puerto Rico has already started long before this report, and I don't doubt that, to reach out and to try and maximize the opportunity. I will just underline again that easing how business is done on this island is a big part of that perception. And so improving the ease of doing business, improving the infrastructure, improving our labor participation rates, improving our education outcomes, all of those structural reforms that we've been talking about for almost 4 years now as a board, they continue to be the underpinning for many decisions, despite what tax incentives or other federal incentives may come down the path. And I think that being able to seize these opportunities is up to all of us. It's clearly the government will be doing what the government can do. The board will do what it can do, but I ask all of you as well to help in this change, to help both press on the structural reforms that need to be done, to identify and to tell your success stories. Many of you are the success stories. Those success stories aren't getting out enough. It's not enough for the board or the government to talk about its competitive strengths. It is so much more credible when you all speak from a position of having invested the hard-earned dollars into Puerto Rico to speak about those competitive strengths. So I ask you to help us inform and help us strengthen Puerto Rico's voice in this debate as we try to reshore. I hope this report will be helpful, although I know it doesn't cover every single question. We'll try to answer some of the questions you now have. I'm going to go through them in the order that they came in. I tried to get folks to answer some of them along the way, so some of them I think we've answered, but the ones that remain open, and please don't hesitate, at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A function. Please submit any questions you'd like asked. So the first question I have here is for John Cox. What would potential manufacturing like to hear from your perspective in order to fall in love with Puerto Rico as a relocation initiative? And I think the question really could be for any of you on the BCG team, what you were hearing from Pharma. What would cause potential manufacturers to fall in love with relocating in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I may turn that to Aaron first, and then I'm happy to chime in as well, because it's broader than that.
It's interesting. If you could bring back up the presentation, please, and jump to slide 25. There's actually a number of other things that we've heard that could potentially be valuable. What would they really like to hear here? A lot of these things are what they'd like to hear. So you can see, I won't cover all of this. Practically, what they're looking for from Puerto Rico is getting back to the idea of a significant cost advantage in Puerto Rico. And this, I think that paired with making very clear how you can reduce the capital investment. So you've heard during our presentation us talk a bit about this idea of return on invested capital, and that being especially important for companies that are lower margin, like generics, some of the med techs and the contract development organizations. If you can do some things that are going to bring their ongoing costs down and also defer that capital investment, again, versus the places that you're going to be competing in, some of the lower cost areas, the economically depressed zones, I think it sets up Puerto Rico reasonably well to win. Then you need to step back and say, which scenario am I in? How much is really moving overall? Is this going to be a question about incremental expansion, or is a wave overall of significant manufacturing coming to the US? In that latter scenario, a significant wave is coming back. There can be things done that really do get at the ongoing tax, as well as making very clear and get a site up quickly, and we can help you defer the capital investment. That's music to a lot of companies' ears that would be a good fit for Puerto Rico. John, Ben, anything you'd build on that?
No, I think that's right. And I think particularly what we heard pretty loud and clear from the lower cost manufacturers, or the more cost conscious, manufacturers, was that the economic development zone credits, I believe the questioner was fall in love, those would be enough to move the needle. Again, not discounting their other things that they're concerned about, like infrastructure, political stability, etc., but those would be things that would move the needle.
Yeah, and maybe the only thing, Aaron, I would highlight from this page is there is, and it's harder to quantify, but there is this narrative around the that the resiliency of operations, are challenging due to hurricanes or what have you. I think there are good stories as well about the resilience that maybe have been overshadowed by perceptions, and so kind of changing that narrative and focusing on, yes, obviously it's been a series of challenging years, yet the resilience, there are a lot of pockets of very good stories. I think that would help as well.
Thank you. I'm going to group some of these questions together for the sake of time. The next question is about R&D, and there are two of them. One is, would a university strategic partnership improve our chances? For example, promote SBIR program with NIH. Or another saying that the report doesn't really take into consideration the innovation and R&D capabilities of Puerto Rico and what needs to be improved from the University of Puerto Rico or the Science Trust and the entire innovation ecosystem, so that Puerto Rico could go to the next level and attract more innovative products. Maybe that's more long-term, but would be interesting to see. So could you comment on that facet, the R&D, the more innovative products, the companies that are dealing with research?
I would say absolutely things like that could improve chances, but I think, Natalie, where you were going, improve chances at what? It's a time horizon question in our mind, and as we took our lens of what was going to potentially move the needle near to midterm, even focusing on those partnerships, which is something that's absolutely necessary and the right answer mid to longer term, probably it wasn't going to really move the needle from an in-sourcing perspective in the near term. That's where we came back to pay attention to your areas of strength, double down there, keep moving. So I think it's a fair point. The mid to longer term, absolutely focus on getting more of the innovators, disruptors, specific lens we took, more near in what's going to be impacting in sourcing near term.
And I'll just add that from the board's perspective, we focused quite a bit in the University of Puerto Rico fiscal plan on trying to encourage them to seek out more of those federal grants, to encourage more of the R&D on island, and to enable, for example, many of the PhD students who are leaving the island to do their research abroad to do it instead here on the island. Another set of questions has to do with the treatment of CFC. So I'll read a couple of the questions together and then maybe we can comment. The report assumes that the distress zone program incentives may be available to CFCs and branches of U.S. domiciled parent companies. Has BCG assessed or consulted whether CFC structures may be combined with the tax credits offered under the distress zone proposal? Also, another question similar, the distress zone incentives would have to be more attractive and beneficial to current CFCs, otherwise it may not lure them to change their CFC structures. Has BCG assessed if the distress zone program will be attractive enough to lure these companies to expand in PR? I think, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw a sort of simplifying narrative that I think connects a lot of these questions, and then John or maybe even Adam can chime in more on the sort of the more detailed tax nuances. So in looking to Aaron's point on time horizon and where our focus was, if you just are looking near term and assuming that there will be an EDZ piece of legislation, your competitive set becomes lower cost locations within the US, right? So everything that's here around R&D and innovation and increasing the competitiveness generally of Puerto Rico is all valid, particularly longer term and continuing to increase your value proposition against overseas locations or against folks like in the Research Triangle. But you do have an advantage. If you assume there's a wave of companies coming back, and some of them are going to be looking for these lower cost scenarios, then despite your needs, you're ahead of a lot of these other economically distressed zones, right? So it comes to your competitor set in that scenario, right? And so all of those things are valid longer term, but that near term is a limited competitor set, and thus you have that's what we looked at within that competitor set. Similarly, in the whole CFC company move, I think we argued, and Aaron and John can chime in here, but what I would emphasize in John's discussion around the tax impacts, we focused on the impacts that would happen to generic CDMOs and some of the OEMs, right? The actual large manufacturers were not necessarily convinced that either of the pieces of legislation would currently have an economic impact that would influence their moves significantly, right? Other than they'd serve as a factor, but the actual material impact would not be as big relative to them as others. So when you look at the impact we're projecting on Puerto Rico, that actually assumes a large proportion of that is based on or derived from the impact of generic CMOs, CDMOs, and other players, not the traditional big pharma manufacturers per se, in terms of the overwhelming influence of the legislation.
John, Adam, do you want to comment just on CFC application to the distress zones? Adam?
Yeah, in terms of changes to federal law, there's a number of proposals currently under consideration in Congress. At this point, it's unclear which one of any will ultimately become law, but in terms of the competitiveness factor, it's definitely something to consider.
So let me just add that from the board's perspective, again, we're looking at both. We're looking at the CFCs on island expanding and the potential of someone moving onto the island, potentially organizing themselves as a CFC, potentially organizing themselves as a domestic subsidiary. And what we were trying to do was to identify what would have to be improved in the legislation for each of those different categories, or what would be enough to incentivize someone to move instead of to another distressed zone to Puerto Rico. So we're looking at all of it, and there's no perfect legislation yet from what we see, but there is the basis for which to discuss different application of different to different kinds of companies in each of them. And so our goal was to be able to be informative to those who are moving legislation to the extent that it's moving, and talk about how it would apply in each case. Let me get through a couple of these questions relatively quickly. We have do you factor in the opportunity zone investments? We did not have time or include that in the analysis. Did we focus on the 4% versus the excise tax being an incentive or alternatives for its replacement? We did not. We did not focus on whether or not the excise tax, the 154, would remain in place or not. Again, I've said this previously, it is my belief that over time it will have to be replaced with something else, but this report did not go into the issue of the 4% either as a incentive or as something to be replaced. The island being the question, everything on this island is politics. Have you analyzed the results of the possible impact of the referendum in November on statehood? No, we stayed out of politics to the extent possible. That was the absolute goal of this, was to be as apolitical and look at simply the economic side of it to the extent possible. Again, if the Act 154 excise tax is eliminated and PR income tax increased to compensate, the guilty elimination plus credits could be significant. Do we agree? We didn't look at that. We can, but we have not looked at that calculation of it going away. How can we call for action as to economic development where all stakeholders come together, including the fiscal board, politicians, private sector, and NGO? I don't think you can ever ask for everyone to come together, especially all different politicians of every color and stripe. I think the best we can do is be in touch with one another, and to the extent that we align in our interests, we can work together. We are more than happy to have our government relations work with anyone who agrees with this approach. Again, our goal in Washington is simply to have any legislation that's passed, have the authors understand how it affects Puerto Rico and how it may be improved to affect entry into Puerto Rico. Let me see. While risks associated with Puerto Rico as an investment jurisdiction were briefly mentioned in your report, I'd like you to comment on how those risks could impact an effort to attract to the island the inshoring of new manufacturing installations. In particular, I'm concerned about the increased negative projection of the territory besieged by political instability and government gridlock, and of a utility infrastructure that is still very vulnerable to the impact of hurricanes and earthquakes. So I think the report, and we've made clear that there are perceptions, and for every company, that perception risk and the calculation of risk reward is very different and unique to that company. So I don't think there's a single answer to this other than we all need to do better. We need to improve the perception. We need to improve the reality. We need to improve the reliability of our electricity. We need to reduce the political gridlock. And so I think we're all probably agreed that we need to do better. We all need to do better if we want to make the most of this opportunity. Regarding technology resilience operations with redundancy services with more than one telecommunication company as provider, regarding the new normal, is it considered some work position be telecommuting? We didn't look into the issue of the one telecommunication company or telecommuting. Certainly something that could benefit Puerto Rico, given it's such an incredibly beautiful place to live. But that was not something we looked into in this short period of time. Do you think yesterday's situation will change the investor's perception of local rule of law? I believe that yesterday it was a very sad day for all Puerto Ricans who deserve a right to vote in a simple fashion. I think it is a sign of managerial competency at the State Elections Commission, unfortunately. But I don't believe that a single event would cause anyone to change their view. I think the perception of Puerto Rico is built on many, many, many different points. And I would, again, go to all of you with your success stories and ask you to make them more well-known. Offer to put op-eds in newspapers, not just on the island, but off the island, in magazines, in industry works. We're happy to publish success stories on our own website and distribute them to a broad distribution. We need to get all sides of it out. The negative hits the front page of the newspapers easily, and the positives tend to stay hidden. So I think we can all work together on that. On contract manufacturers, I think there's a question here. I think we answered it already. If not, we'll ask you to kind of take a look at the report. The answers, do you think I should? So I think I've covered almost all of them, if not all of them, to a large degree. I want to thank everyone. I know that we've taken quite a bit of your work day today and your time, and we appreciate that. We appreciate your input, we appreciate your questions, and we hope that this dialogue can continue. The board has a specific person responsible for the ease of doing business, Lizzie Rosso. Many of you know her, if not all of you. I urge you to keep in touch with Lizzie, keep in touch with the board. And again, I suggest that we work together to the extent that we agree. We work together in Washington to make sure that legislators understand how the proposed legislation will or will not affect Puerto Rico and how we can make the proposed legislation better. In the interim, I know there are other short-term solutions coming. I know that Admiral Brown is leading a White House delegation later in August to talk about how the Defense Production Act could be utilized for short-term financing of projects. I know that there is discussion about using other tax incentives here on island as well. So we will be supportive of all of that. Last thing I'll say is this report and this video will be made available on our website. The previous version of this, which was presented to the board during a public meeting earlier in August, is already on our website, so it's available immediately. And I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and I hope we can take advantage of this together. Thank you all very much.